So everybody, we are going to go ahead and get started. We have some new people here today. So Claudia Jerkovitz is an epidemiologist who I've worked with for quite a while here at Christiana. She's also part of the Value Institute and also part of the Biostats and Epidemiologic Core for the CTR. Rick Kaplan is pretty new to us, right? You've been here.
I started in October.
Okay.
So I came from AstraZeneca, and I'm a statistician. I work in the Value Institute also.
Okay. And he is one of the biostatisticians specifically with a role in the CTR.
That's right.
So they are probably going to ask you guys all to introduce yourselves. And do you guys all know Marcy Dries? Marcy Dries, you'll get to know her even better next time. She is actually part of the teaching and educational core, mentoring core for the CTR, also an epidemiologist. She's actually our hospital epidemiologist. And her and another person next week, Mia Pappas, will be talking to you guys more about study design. So our goal here was to keep this fairly interactive. And I guess the other thing, we talked about this ahead of time. I mean, nobody's fooling themselves that we're going to teach you all of, study design, research methods, and biostatistics, in 2 hours or less. But we really wanted to kind of... We wanted to, give you the basics, ways to think about what it is you're going to do with this project and maybe your next step, so that you could begin to communicate your needs and desires in terms of data and data analysis to the people that actually do the work.
Sounds pretty good. Should I get there? Should I?
You guys know you're being recorded as well, right?
Full disclosure. After we sat down, took off our coat, she says, "Oh, by the way, we're being recorded."
I guess I should try to tell people that before they come. But not before they agree to come, just before they
In my presentation, I don't have a workshop, but I do expect there to be some discussion here, so it's not a lecture. The other thing is it's not really a statistics lecture at all, because I didn't think that was so appropriate for the kind of projects we have here. These are earlier projects, pilot projects. If they lead to something bigger, better later on, that's where the analytics statistics will probably kick in. And I know that this is a mixed group, some with a lot of experience, some with less experience. So I did start out just saying why I have a job, why there are statisticians involved with research. And then go on to some basic research considerations, talk a little bit about my view of pilot studies versus later more definitive studies, and a bit about methodology. Again, not really emphasizing statistics methodology. And I do have some notes here. So why don't you do that? Okay. The reason statisticians have jobs and why we're involved is we do add some objectivity to the research. That is, I did go to your presentations, ACEAwards presentations. Hello! Just started, so come on in.
Thank you.
Perfect timing. I'm Rick Kaplan. I'm a statistician with Christiana Value Institute, and Claudia is sharing this presentation. And I'm starting out by trying to explain how statisticians get involved and why we're involved with research. And one is the objectivity. That is, I went to your presentations at the ACE Awards, saw your posters, and all of you have a passion for what you're doing. You're really very much involved. You're a champion of certain ideas. But if you're going to be developing a research proposal to go on to the next step, you do need to be able to convince someone else objectively about why your proposal is valid and why it's very solid. And I think statisticians can help with that kind of objectivity. The other is a variability. Keep it on this. This is really why statisticians have a job. That is, everybody is different. In any kind of research you do, whether it's something objective like body mass index and change in body mass index over a period of time, if you have some sort of intervention, or their perspectives, patients' perspectives of community health workers. Everybody's response is going to be different depending on their situation. And what statisticians try to do analytically is sort through the variability and try to find out truth or what the message is with all the variability. So that's what the analytic statistics are about. And the last point about statistics is that the difference between a study, which is a sample of a larger population, and the population. That is, any time you do a study, you're not studying everybody you care about. You can't afford to. You're really just looking at a sample of the larger population. And what statistics does, what analytic statistics does, is try to draw conclusions or inferences about the larger population based on the data that you have from your study. Next slide. When I read through the proposals, I was trying to pull out what I thought were just some questions that I might have about them or comment on. And the next slide is one thing I'm afraid I didn't understand all your proposals, and I haven't participated in the earlier sessions. So one thing that was not consistently there was clarity. Clarity in what the goal or objective of the proposal was, clarity in exactly what measurements were going to be taken, and clarity in the study population, just exactly what you're studying. And part of it is my unfamiliar with the kind of work that you're doing. And this is where I hope maybe you can correct me. Next slide. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your first name. Leveda. Studying its obesity in youth. The study population was very clear, grades 1 through 9. But I wasn't clear on the objective because I saw what the ultimate goal was in your study, but I thought I see where you're going, but I wasn't sure of the steps of how you were going to get there, especially with the small grant. That is, ultimately, I can see preventing obesity, improving nutrition, if I got that right, and improving the physical activity of youth. But I wasn't absolutely clear about what the objectives were in the first step. And I think in the sessions before this one, there has been some development of the proposals. Where are you right now?
The real objective is in changing behavior of the children in choosing nutritious foods and engaging in physical activity, and hopefully educating the parents as well about food selections for shopping.
Will you be able to do that with this first grant, or is that more what goes beyond that?
I think so. I think so. With the when we did the nutrition piece with Body and Soul before, there was some changes. How long it was sustained is another question.
Because this is not cannot be a long-term study.
Right.
And how do you measure that kind of a change?
It was through our faith-based kitchen food selections and self-reporting of what people did at home, but it was getting the changes in the churches and their offerings to the congregants.
Yeah, I haven't done these kind of studies. I don't know if anybody else has, but I've done something similar where they ask people to keep diaries. Is that the sort of thing?
Well, it was more just self-reporting.
Did you use a specific survey or tool? Did you use a specific survey or tool in terms of what you asked them about their eating?
No, it was the food selections. It was really budgetary. See what food was selections, the changes in the offerings to the congregation, like more fruits and vegetables as opposed to a lot of starches and things.
Coffee and donuts, which is what we usually do. So were you looking at it on an individual level, or it sounded like more on the congregation level? Like you did the intervention for
the congregation,
and then you looked at what was being selected for that entire congregation.
Right.
So you don't know, like not everyone in the congregation necessarily had the intervention, but you just looked at it.
No, those that came to the refreshment area after, it was really talking with the kitchen staff, more or less, because we had a lot of, in one church, we had a lot of salty foods, and so the reduction in low sodium items and more healthy, more vegetables was offered than the potatoes.
So it's really the offerings that you're looking at, right? You're
The food selections with this group, with the children, we wanted both the parents and children to understand, how to better shop for food and make the healthy, look at the food labels and see what they were getting from that, and changing the behavior of the parents in their shopping selections, and getting kids to understand that when they go down to the corner store, instead of the bag of chips, that they would look for some fruits and vegetables or something healthier, and look at the labels too.
But you're also not aware whether the corner store sells fruits and
Well,
vegetables, which is a big thing.
Yeah,
There may be nothing, choice may be between chips and peanuts, not fruits and vegetables.
that's one of the things that we're trying to work on with Healthy Kids Delaware's, to get more produce into the corner stores, and so there's an initiative going on that will hopefully impact some of that. But just getting the parents and kids to look at, to change their behavior.
Did you say that you measured budgets, like what they were actually spending their food budgets?
Yes.
Okay. So you intervened with parents and child, but you measured how the places were spending their money in terms
What
of
they
food.
were spending it on. Yeah.
the places meaning the congregations. Okay, so
At the church.
So your target is also the congregation, like the whoever's doing the food for the congregation.
Kitchen staff.
Kitchen staff.
Mhm.
So that's one level of measurement that you're doing, not just the individuals.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because ultimately, they're the boss in the kitchen.
Next the value of community health workers. The ultimate objective is to assess the value of community health workers from the patient's perspective in the survey. And a lot of this first steps, as I understand, is actually developing this. I wasn't sure how far the project actually goes as far as administering it or planning it. I wasn't sure where it stopped. There's a lot of effort I could see going into the development of the survey. And
Right.
This is like, I don't know this is survey development. This is good stuff.
So So thanks for that. So the year that that the pilot is designed to run would be actually doing qualitative analysis based on 12 focus groups up and down the state of targeted patients and family members who have had interactions with community health workers over the past 12 months or so, and then taking that information, the qualitative information, and working with community health workers to pull out different themes and categories assigned as patients assigned value to community health workers, using that information, the themes and the categories, to actually design an instrument that would be potentially utilized by programs that implement community health workers along a wide variety of spectrum. So the notion is that right now there's not a common definition of community health workers in Delaware, and they run the gamut from far upstream, more sort of lay health type of individuals who help more with social needs, and it can run all the way to more case management type of models, which tends to be the preferred method of hospital systems and care providers, because it's much more aligned with their population health goals. And within that sort of wide variety of definitions, there's different ways that these groups are measuring the effectiveness of these folks, and they're quite different. And so we don't really have a good understanding of what the impact of community health workers is, because under this umbrella, there's such a variety of ways that they're being measured. And so our sort of hypothesis, if you will, is that if you can design a evaluation tool that is focused on the sort of a patient's perception of value of these folks, that it could perhaps bring into alignment some of those other ways that they're being measured.
Yeah, well, and that might come up again later, because got to have a discussion about reliability and validity of surveys, and is there some plan to compare the results that your survey would ultimately get to what some other methods of evaluating the value of the community health workers?
Sure. So at the end of this pilot, we hope to actually have a sort of demonstration tool, right? An evaluation tool that we would then bring to the groups that we know are utilizing community health workers in the state of Delaware. The next step, a possible follow-up or a larger grant, would be to actually implement those evaluation tools in the field, and over a period of time assess both validity, reliability, as well as how well those programs are able to use that, process measures, how well those programs are able to use them, or if they even feel that they're useful to the development of the program.
Those 12 small groups, do you already have those selected?
No, the focus groups.
Actually, some discussion of selecting.
Sure.
I do something about sampling, but for the focus group, it's so incredibly different and random than, the usual
sampling.
statistic sampling.
Yeah,
right.
Yes, but we still like to be able to
Right, no, absolutely.
representative a larger population. And the next this is yours about including youth with disabilities. This is the Youth Tobacco Survey. That's what that acronym stands for. And right now, as I understand it, in the standardized administration of this Youth Tobacco Survey, they skip over kids in special ed classes. And the question here, the objective is there a way to validly include the people, particularly the kids in special ed classes? Measurements, correct me if I'm wrong, which I easily could be here. Comprehension, whether there's comprehension the content, completion rates, and then you also do mention the validity and the reliability of the administration of the surveys to these youths. And the population, as I understand it, is youth with disabilities and special ed classes pre-K all the way through grade 12, I think.
Well, it's really middle school,
Middle
high
school,
school.
not pre-K. We're not going to, because the youth tobacco survey is only done through 6th to 12th graders, so we're not trying to look at the younger kids.
Good.
And another thing, you guys aren't going to be looking at comprehension of content so much, right?
Well, I think it depends on what,
How far away through it we get. Some classrooms, comprehension of content, I think we expect is not going to be a major issue. Others, their degree of disability may affect their comprehension. So it's sort of how far we delve into. We're pretty sure you can't include everybody in the survey. There are some kids whose disabilities are such that they either can't comprehend or physically can't participate. But we don't know how far down we can go to develop accommodations that can include more and more of these students in surveillance surveys.
right. It also depends on, one of the things that we're looking at is, are there accommodations? Could we administer the survey in a different format than it currently is? It's, paper and pencil now, but if it was done on a tablet, for example, could a student participate?
Okay.
So in terms of whatever those accommodations might be, there may be a question about comprehension because of the alternate format.
Okay. Is one of the alternate formats actually having somebody
Well,
do it as sort of an
well, see,
interview?
this is one of the critical issues because for CDC, it's confidential,
It's anonymous.
anonymous.
Yeah.
And so if you have somebody assisting you, does that would that alter your response?
And
That's what I
it
was
definitely
wondering.
alters your need to consent and how you would go about getting informed consent.
So that's kind
that's
of,
what I was wondering when I was looking
that's
through
sort
it.
of the tension there of, how much assistance or how much accommodation can you do without kind of
Absolutely.
threatening that core concept of what the survey is.
While it may not be that big an issue for the youth tobacco survey, there's at least one other or two other health surveys that maybe get into some more sensitive areas that this is kind of a precursor. The youth tobacco surveys, we're using that for an initial
It's the foot in the door
round, and then we're hoping that maybe some of these accommodations then can be more generalizable to the other surveys as well.
And you're not talking about self-contained special ed classes. You're talking about current students with IEPs who are excluded, right?
We're looking at everything. Where
But
everything's on
it's
the
not
table.
just people who, not just students in special ed classes, because there's a lot of kids that are included that aren't.
Well,
Right, so the classrooms that are excluded now are if there's more than 50% of the students enrolled in special ed in the classroom. And then the schools, like special schools, those are excluded.
Mm-hmm.
So,
There are some kids who have an IEP, who have a special ed classification, who do the survey because they're in a regular classroom,
Right.
and they're considered to be able to keep up with the work in that classroom, and so they can handle getting a piece of paper on a survey in front of them, filling it out, turning it back in, even though they still have an IEP classification.
Mm-hmm.
But there are many who are in classrooms where there's, in a sense, the majority, if not all of the students, are IEP classifications, or schools where that aren't.
right, and so the question is, in those classrooms that are sort of all special ed,
Self-contained, yeah.
are there kids, the assumption that we have is that there are kids in those classrooms who could participate. Not everybody, but some of those kids could participate, but because of the way it's structured now, they're not given that opportunity.
Going to Mike and Sean's, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the objective here is really assessing the community needs.
Yeah.
It's assessing what facilities are available now But I think there's also where it's also looking at some of the attitude towards physical activity and cancer survival. Is some of that?
Absolutely. I think the only thing we'd add is just how even that information is, in addition to what are the facilities, how's that information is or isn't being provided to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but yeah, absolutely.
But it's also partially what they're interested in having provided.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Come on. As I mentioned before, I come from a background where I've admittedly worked on larger studies, later phase studies, especially in drug development. But as reading through these, it's clear that these are pilot studies. And again, the background in drug development, a lot of times we'd see protocols for studies that were frankly just inadequate. They were comparing two drug treatments, but they were way too small to actually draw any conclusion about that. And the justification were, well, this is just a pilot study. Well, it may be, but pilot studies are valid, but you do learn something about them. And what you often learn about them is enough information to help you develop the next study. And so if you have a pilot study in your proposal, you should be very clear about what you're learning from that. It's going to help you with the next grant proposal or drug development with the next protocol. Next slide. So pilot forwards. So a pilot study is really a preparatory study. It could be just studying methods that would be used in a larger study, whereas the larger, bigger, more expensive studies, pivotal studies or more definitive studies. And both here and I think in drug development, a typical study design would be a randomized study where you compare two or more interventions. An example of why it might be comparative, I was thinking about the proposal for obesity in youth, and if you just followed some kids and you changed their behavior, their nutrition, their physical activity, but you just looked at one group over a period of time, and you say, oh, they changed. But there could be a lot of other things going on in their lives that cause that change. Plus, when kids are growing up, they're growing up quickly. There's just their natural growth underlying it. So that the way you try to find out if your interventions actually make a difference would be to compare kids with interventions, learning about nutrition, physical activity, versus those who are the control group, and they just went about their normal lives. And so it's a randomized study which tries to eliminate the bias between the groups that you might have in assigning the people to one or the other group. You can then say that at the end, if there's any differences, the one thing that you know that's different is your intervention, both your education and any physical activity you encourage them to do. So the larger studies are typically comparative studies where you do have some control and can just point to the one difference in the groups, your intervention. Next slide. So the pilot study is a preparatory study. Could be checking out a design, procedures or the measurements for the larger studies. If I misstated this, I apologize, but I think all these studies, one way or the other, are going to have surveys in them. And one thing that you would want to do in these pilot studies, and several of you mentioned it in your proposals, is test it on a group of people. Before you actually do the survey, test it out. That is, I could write a survey, I could write questions, and I'll understand what I'm asking, but you don't know if it's going to be misunderstood or not by other people unless you test out the survey on another group of people. And I'm making the point again that a pilot study is not just a small, inadequate, definitive study. You are trying to learn something from the pilot studies. It'll help you in your bigger studies. And some examples, I think, are the development in studies for the community health workers, and which would lead to testing the pilots, in looking at the youth being tested with this youth tobacco survey. They're certainly going to test out any procedures or changes that you make in the administration of the youth tobacco survey. And with the cancer survivor, again, you're explicitly going out and trying to learn about, assess the community needs and also attitude of cancer survivors. Methodology. When I looked over what I have here, I thought one thing I omitted that Brian had actually explicitly mentioned. If you're doing a survey, you need to collect the data. You need to collect the information. And he specifically mentioned using something that we've got, we use a lot, is RedCap. RedCap is free, but it is a system for an easy way to design surveys and collect the data. It was new to me coming to Christiana, but it looks really good. It's just a good way to collect the data. It doesn't help you design. You still have to design your surveys, but it's a good system. And as far as methodology, the most important, I think, we discussed, because it is common to all the projects, is reliability and validity. Reliability means precision. It means that the way you ask the question is such that you will consistently get the same response. It's stability in a measurement if the measurement were repeated several times under identical situations. Validity, on the other hand, is accuracy. That is, you're asking a question to measure exactly what you meant to measure. So for example, something that's reliable but not valid is you're asking the question the wrong way, but you're consistently getting the wrong answer. It's reliable because it is precise, but it's precisely wrong. It's not what you really meant to ask. Where something that's valid but not reliable is you're asking the right question, but it's such that you're getting a large variation in the responses. So here, this is a little diagram trying to show the difference between reliability and validity. So the first one here is reliable. That is, it's precise. You're getting a lot of answers that are closely bunched together, but you've missed the mark here. You're not really measuring what you intended to measure. Now in this case, all the answers are centered around what you're aimed at, but unfortunately they're a little spread out, which means it's going to be hard to make some sense of them. And of course you want to have both precision and the accuracy. This is, an easy question. Youth tobacco survey is a validated survey. Which question would be in the youth tobacco survey? Have you ever been a smoker? Or have you ever tried cigarette smoking even 1 or 2 puffs? You've seen it.
I'm not going to answer. You guys can figure it out.
Which question is in it?
So the reason the second question is much better than the first question is that it is very specific. Have you ever tried cigarette smoking, either 1 or 2 puffs? The first question, do you mean cigarette smoking? Do you mean cigar smoking? Do you include marijuana? Do you talking about the past few years, or in my case, if I tried smoking when I was 10 years old or something like that? I mean, it may not even be reliable or consistent. That is, I may answer that same question different this week and next week and the week after, because I could interpret it differently depending on what's on my mind or what I've been reading or anything in between. It's another reason why anytime you develop a survey, you've got to test it out with other people to make sure it's not misinterpreted by other people. Develop larger, I'll say standardized surveys, but just to show you the kind of things that go into some of these validated surveys to assess the reliability of a survey. There are various ways they go about it. One is test and retest. That is, I take the survey now, I could take the survey again in a week, and I look to make sure that there is a strong correlation in the answers from week to week, or very little variability. And it has to be separated enough in time so that I don't remember what I answered before. There's no training effect. And a lot of the big surveys, and I think this probably includes some of the educational surveys, is you can have two items that actually address the same thing with minor changes in the wording, or they can have a group of items measuring the same thing. You look for that internal consistency. Validity, that is looking for the accuracy, is there's several stages here. And I have heard people say that they put a survey together and it has face validity, which is supposed to be some phrase, but it actually just means it looks good to me, you know? And it's not really very helpful. It's not really testing anything out. But testing it out with some experts is a good thing. If there is a gold standard, testing it out against the gold standard, like you may be able to do a simpler, cheaper test, but it actually is just as good as a more expensive test, just as valuable. And then construct out how meaningful is it when it's used in practice. Since professionally I'm a statistician, I have to throw in something a little bit statistical. If you're working with a statistician, they will probably talk about something about the types of data that you're collecting, because it does affect the kind of analysis that a statistician does if you're getting to the point of doing some analytic statistics. The top two are not numbers, they're qualitative. The bottom two are numbers or quantitative. Categorical data just means categories. Ordinal data are categories, but they have some natural order. So the category, and I do have a couple of slides from the youth tobacco survey after this. It's the one validated survey that was handed to me, so I use it for examples. How did you get your tobacco? And they have several examples of ways of getting it. And those are just different categories. On the other hand, how often did you see ads for cigarettes? Well, it could be from never to just sliding scale, and they're in order. Numbers, discrete, counting. How many days this week from 0 to 7 did you ride in a vehicle where someone was smoking? And that's just 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then a continuous variable would be something like body mass index or weight. And these are examples from the tobacco survey. I shrunk it a little bit to get it on the slide here. But during the past 30 days, this quarter did. Oh, great. How often did you get your own chewing tobacco snuff or dip? You can choose one answer or more than one answer. And I think that actually is very important. If you are going to have categories like this, and this is where you might find it out by testing it on somebody else, it may not, you in your mind may think they're just going to pick one, because typically a person just buys tobacco one way, but a person could certainly buy it more than one way. So they give the instruction. You can choose one answer, or you can choose more than one answer. And then they give a range here. And then there's this nice catch-all category at the end. I got it some other way. So there's an answer for everybody. And that's another point with a good, well-designed question. Statisticians hate missing data. It really screws things up if you have missing data. You have to make sure anything you can do if you're going to administer a survey to get people to answer all of the questions. Because if someone skips an answer, we don't know if their answer was going to be like somebody else's, or they skipped it because it was different, or they didn't understand it. There could be a variety of reasons, and we don't want to be in a position of trying to assume why there's missing data.
Rick, what do you think about, a lot of software in terms of different sort of imputation algorithms for missing data? Do you see value in that?
Well, there is value in it, but first I'll say that statisticians in practice don't like missing data.
Yeah.
When they're in graduate school, it's actually the source of a lot of dissertations. there's value in it, but I think in any method, but particularly in the way missing value is dealt with, you have to understand the assumptions behind it.
Sure.
Like there's a variety of methods for imputing missing data, and some assume that the person is like another person and it requires a very large sample demographically. And so they probably would have answered it this way. Or others just say, well, we'll just put it in the average and let it slide and assume that they, the missing data would average out.
Yeah.
But anytime you're analyzing that case, you are making some assumptions.
Sure.
But if you exclude that person entirely from the sample, you're making other assumptions. You may be losing some valuable information. So you are caught. So the first thing that anybody will tell you is do everything you can to avoid missing data.
So two questions. So binary data, a lot of like yes, no, did or not. That's technically a categorical.
Yeah, two categories, yes.
And then going back to what you said about the survey, survey data and reliability and validity, do we have resources within the CTR in terms of if we were working on surveys to kind of get some help around that? Do we know?
I think the Epi-Biostat consulting group is supposed to be able to provide that kind of feedback. So there's a form if you go to the Epi-Biostat key component area in the cell, you can actually submit a form and ask for help all the way from a small statistic question up to helping critique my methods for this grant proposal I want to put in. So it's sort of like there's some ability to get that kind of help.
Yeah, there's a consultation form, and I'll say that we have a Blue Jeans meeting every week where we review new requests for consultation. It's either, as you say, reviewing something, like I just reviewed a study proposal, but some could be for analysis. Yes.
And Ryan was from UD as part of in his role through that mechanism was really helpful at the
He
beginning.
participates in this.
Ryan Pulley.
Yeah, the statistician at UD.
Yeah, great.
And this would be ordered or an ordinal type of variable. When you read newspapers, how often do you see ads for cigarettes? In newspapers, never, through, always. This is not a number, these aren't numbers, but there is obviously an order from never to always. So it's an ordered variable.
And this is getting to be a very dated question because the number of our students who say I do not read newspapers is getting really big.
That's interesting, that's right. So you're thinking about changing the survey?
That's part of the thing. They have not fully developed this in terms of like getting your news from online sources and things like that. So
online is there's some
part of the problem is having a survey that you repeat over time is that things change. Your questions may be getting out of date.
It's supposed to be updated from time to time, but sometimes it takes a while for it to catch up.
Particularly when it involves the federal government.
Not to mention the vast majority of the ads you see online now are tailored to your viewing habits.
That's
so
right.
if you happen to look for, cigarette coupons or something, at one point that cookie's going to follow you all the way through. So the next time you see the news, you're going to get an advertisement for Marlboro.
That's right. So in a sense, it's becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing in terms of the way the search engines work now. If you look at anything, they're going to start plugging it into your profile.
So is there a discussion for changing the surveys?
Every year there's a discussion for changing the survey. The CDC, though, being what it is, doesn't like to change things too often.
We twist their arm a lot.
And a lot of the things and part of the difficulty is that it's hard. Since they've had this question in here, you might want to sort of continue to sort of see the decline in newspaper readerships, just so you know that. But you're missing the other part, so that there's a constant pressure to add questions without questions coming out. So how do you keep the survey at a reasonable length when people want to know more and more every year? And they don't necessarily want you to stop asking what you're already asking.
I think that question actually has some other pieces. it's not just newspapers, I think it's some other things, magazines and
I
other.
think there may be something
Yeah.
that.
I had to fit it on the slide. There's
Yeah,
some
yeah.
ellipses there.
It seemed like it was the only thing.
Excuse me for that. Okay, next. We just have a few more slides here, but just to say something about data collection, because it seems like surveys are something common here, plus there are some mentions of interviews and focus groups. And talking about interviews, I really just don't have all that much to say about this. And I have much less personal experience here. Is some interviews would just be structured, very structured, that is, a verbal questionnaire. So instead of handing somebody a piece of paper, somebody's reading it and recording the answers. And I wasn't sure if that when I was writing, I asked you that question earlier. I wasn't sure if that's one of the modifications that you would need to implement.
One thing we're looking into.
There's a possibility there. Yeah. And then some interviews are certainly less structured, more open-ended, where you could ask some structured questions, but then have more open-ended questions about their attitudes towards community health workers. This is where I was trying to read an article about some good practice, and right away I got hung up, I'll say. I understand the part about neutral body language and not trying to lead them on, but they said things about being encouraging or smiling, and I was trying to think there are some situations where even that could be interpreted as leading them on. And so it wasn't clear. I realized it was out of my depth there. Because I realized that it's very difficult to objectively conduct an interview with somebody else when you are not influencing the way they're answering. You can say what the good techniques are and you can go through some training, but it's really hard to do, and especially for you folks because you have a strong opinion about, well, what the right thing to do is here. I think it would be hard for you to be objective in interviewing somebody else. This is my statistical methodology slide. So when you get into statistical methodology for your bigger studies, everybody does descriptive statistics, including graphics, just representing what you have in the study you have. But in the very beginning, I mentioned that studies are really just samples of a larger population. You really are trying to learn about the larger population. So estimation, if you're reading something and talking about the confidence intervals about something, what they're really saying is trying to say how good your estimate is from this study about that larger population. And likewise with hypothesis testing, it talks about p-values, the probability of getting this under a null hypothesis. You're trying to draw inferences about a larger population from your study, but you always have to keep in mind you're not just describing the study. If you do a study, you have two groups of people, you don't need a statistician to say they're different. Obviously they're different. You're trying to say whether the population would be different if you had two different interventions. And then the other consideration where statisticians certainly get involved in planning the study is sample size. It's going to be important in a pilot study, making sure you have enough information to learn what you need to learn for your next proposal. When you get on to the pivotal studies, the more definitive studies, there needs to be a more rigorous estimate of the sample size, making sure that it is large enough to make the conclusions that you want to make if that's the way the data go. And the last slide that I have, before going on to Claudine, is what Steve said. There is that mechanism for asking for consultation within the CTR. There are researchers, physicians, epidemiologists there, statisticians, and data analysts. So you can ask for help in consulting at any stage of your research. That's all I have for introducing Claudine. Is there anything else you want to talk about now, or do you want to move on to Claudine?
Thanks, that's great.
Thank you.
when we discussed the projects and what we wanted to do, something that when I reread and I read the posters, something that really struck me is that we need to have a good understanding of what population is and how to draw and how to get a sample and what's the best samples to get. And that's something we, at any level, we always struggle with, because the first thing we have to do when we do some analysis or some research or study, we have to define our population and what's the denominator. And that's a question that, all the time, what is our denominator? How do we define our denominator? And all the time, and in any type of study, that's something we always struggle with. So I wanted to spend a little time, and I have only a few slides on definition of population and sampling. So population, we have obviously it's a complete set of people with specified characteristics. And so first we have to describe what is a target population. So for example, you want to study asthma in teenagers, and that will be in the world. What is the prevalence of asthma in teenagers? That's your population, asthma. Teenagers with asthma. And then you want to have an accessible, from the target population, which is the world, or maybe the United States, or one country, you have to restrict it to a more accessible population. So, for example, I'm very interested in chronic kidney disease. So my target population is all patients with chronic kidney disease, stage 3 to 5, for example, in the United States. That's my target population. However, it's going to be very hard for me to study all patients with chronic kidney disease in the United States. So my accessible population will be more defined with geographic characteristics and temporally characteristic, like all patients with chronic kidney disease, stage 3 to 5, in Delaware, in 2014. That will be my target population. And then from this target population, I want to do some statistics. I want to know, for example, what are the preferences for the patients with chronic kidney disease in terms of renal replacement therapy, meaning whether do they prefer to go to hemodialysis when they reach end-stage renal disease, or do they have preferences on the type of dialysis they would like to have, hemodialysis, peritoneal dialysis, or even transplantation. So I want to do some type of survey like that. Well, it's going to be very hard for me to administer this survey to all the patients and to find, in fact, all the patients in Delaware with chronic kidney disease. So I have to find a sample, and I'll try to get a sample of this population. And maybe my sample could be all the patients who are seen in a nephrology practice in Delaware, and we know what are the nephrology practices in Delaware, and who have chronic kidney disease stage 4 to 5. So that would be my intended study sample. However, I'm not going to have, not all the patients will accept to be in the study. And so the patients who accept in the study will be my actual study sample. Next. So this is a little scheme that I really like. As Rick emphasized, what we want to understand is, your question, what is the truth in the universe? So we mean, what is the truth? The universe would be, the country or the world or something like that. So what is the truth in the universe? And obviously, you cannot assess the whole universe. So your first step, as we said, is to define your target population. And to do that, to specify clinical and demographic characteristics. And you have to, the criteria of your target population really need to match your research question. You need to define again, as Rick emphasized, very well your research question so that you can define your population more accurately. And then you define the second step is to define the accessible population, as we just said. So here you specify the temporal and geographical characteristics. And you want to have a representative target, a representative of your target population. And then finally, this is a truth in the study, your third step is to define your intended sample. And here your criteria will be to have a representative of the accessible population and easy to study. So in my survey, in my research project, that would be patients with chronic kidney disease who are seen by the nephrologist in Delaware. So there are different types of sampling. Most often in research, we do non-probability samples, meaning that the study sample is made up of people who meet entry criteria and are easily available. And we call this a convenience sample. And in fact, in many studies that are published, that's what people are really using, convenience sample. And one example of convenience sample is called a consecutive sample, which minimize voluntarism and any type of selection biases. And what it means is that you select subjects as you see them consecutively. So in my example of patients with chronic kidney disease in Delaware, whom I would select from nephrology practices, I may have also a lot of patients, and it may take a very long time, in fact, to find these patients. So I would say in each office, we will ask patients to participate, the 10 first patients whom we see with chronic kidney disease stage 3 to 5. So you try to be extremely systematic in your selection of people, and consecutive, that's something that you will often find, in fact, in research papers and in studies to take consecutive subjects. The major issue will be that you want to make sure that this population, this sample, is representative of your larger population. And you could introduce some bias by doing these convenience samples. Next slide. So probability samples, these are the gold standard for ensuring generalizability. And that's really your goal. You want to generalize your findings, the findings of your study, to the larger population, to the world. And so what it means is that there needs to be a random process to guarantee that each subject has a pre-specified and equal chance of being selected. And the probability samples are difficult to get for big studies and are very expensive. There are some examples in the country where some studies use, in fact, probability samples. It's, for example, NHEALTH. I don't know whether you've heard. It's the National Health and Examination Survey. It's an ongoing survey on nutrition, on health status, of medication. It's a very, very comprehensive survey that is done every year, basically, and it's a random sample of the United States population. And they build a data set, and you can access the data set and do analysis. But it's extremely expensive. It's something that is done by the government, and it's very expensive. And there are some other well-known studies that have been done with random sampling. So there are several types of random sampling, of probability sampling. The simple random sample, so what you do here, you list all the subjects in your population. So you need to have a defined population that cannot be, well, I guess it can be the United States, but a defined population. And then you select a subset at random, and to do that, you use a table of random numbers. And in fact, I have some examples here. So, there are tables of random numbers now. More and more, it's done by computers, but it's really exactly the same principle. So, for example, let's say that you want to, you have a population that you list as with a number of 1 to 1,000. It's a predefined population. And so what you do is that, and you want to have 10%, you want to find a 10% sample of this 1 to 1,000 number of people. And so you want to randomly select 100 people. So what you do when you have this table of random numbers, and you can find them anywhere on the web, you decide totally arbitrarily which column you want to start with. And so, for example, let's say we start with the second column, and we go each number from the top to the bottom until we have 100 numbers. And we would say we take the first 3 numbers. So, for example, we would select the number 150 from 15011. We would select, we say we take the first 3 numbers of this large number. So we would do 150, 465, 483, 930, and we count 100, and that will be our sample. Does it make sense? Yeah. Okay. And now the computer does that, but it's exactly the same principle. So this is the simplest. The systematic sample, it's kind of the same thing, but what you start by listing all the people in the population, and then you systematically select a preordained periodic process. So, for example, in this survey that they did in New England, Framingham. What they did is that, so Framingham is a very known study of this little city in New England, Framingham, where they studied the cardiovascular disease and relation with hypertension, smoking, and all these kind of things. And the way that they did, they listed all the people in Framingham, and then they selected one of every 2 families. And they went to each of these, every second family, to ask them if they wanted to participate in the study. So it's a way to do that. So many years ago, I was involved into a study in Guinea, Africa, and what we did here also same thing. We went to the villages, and we decided a priori which street to. Or randomly, we would look at being the center of the village and decide which way we are going and select every 2 households where we would go. So that's what is a systematic sample. A stratified random sample. So here, what you want is to divide the population into subgroups according to characteristics. And you do that when you want to enrich your sample with people who are fewer in the population. So, for example, you are very interested in comparing a treatment in elderly patients versus non-elderly. And we know that there are many fewer 80-year-olds. So what you would do is you stratify your population by age, and then you would sample the same number of people according to their age. So you would have the same number of people, you would randomly sample people who are greater or equal than 80, people who are between 60 and 80, people who are between 40 and 60. And you would have exactly the same number, so that you can compare more effectively. Cluster sample, that's also another way of probability sampling. So what you first do, it's what it said, it's random sample of natural grouping. So that's very useful when you have really large communities. And what you do first, you sample a community. So, for example, you decide that you want to study something in the population in Delaware. You would sample certain communities, randomly sample, and take, I don't know, 10 cities in Delaware. And then within these cities, then you randomly sample again the population. Next slide. So this is my last slide. A few more thoughts. As Rick was saying, all the statistics that we do, the descriptive statistics and test of statistical significance, is based on the assumption that you are drawing from a random sample. So whenever you do sampling, whenever you select your population, even if you do a convenient sample, you need to make sure that your sample is generalizable. And you want to make sure, you want to look at the characteristics of the population that you are analyzing, of the sample that you have, and compare it to the characteristics of the population in general, so that you can say that you can generalize your findings, and that's something that is really important. So, as I said earlier, a random sample of the whole target population is rarely possible and is extremely expensive. So convenient sampling is frequently used, and as I said, is it representative of the target population? I think that's all I have, and I wanted to engage in discussion on, again, your population and how you are going to sample your population.
I was going to add something really to the Framingham example that she mentioned. So their intention was to get every other household to participate. That's who they approached. But I think I read also that they didn't have the enrollment that they were hoping for. So then they, after the fact, they ended up opening it up to any other households who wanted to volunteer. Which is fine, but you have to realize, so how is that different from randomly selecting every other? Obviously, the families that wanted to volunteer may be different from those that would just have been randomly selected.
Did they actually look at the first group compared to the people who
I'm not sure to what extent.
I think they decided what differences and help keep their sample attrition from becoming more of an issue than it would.
And then, and ultimately, even though that's established as one of the, founding surveys in cardiovascular disease, that it was in Framingham, Massachusetts, which is certainly not a very representative community compared to the United States, especially now. So a lot of stuff is based off of Framingham, and it certainly has some, even though it's considered to be generally reliable, it's not, it may not be for every population that you're now trying to apply those findings to. So even like the best, most famous studies, always have their issues.
And in fact, the major issue is that they had an attrition of 30%. There are 30% of the population who didn't want to participate. That's why they opened to volunteers. And then who are the volunteers? Most often, what I say is that most often the volunteers are people who are healthier. So it can really bias, your estimates, your population estimates.
I think that was one of the things that I had concerns about with our health ministries, our faith communities. Not all the congregations have the age population that I wanted to look at. Some of our congregations have more older children, some don't have any at all. So that was something that I was very concerned about. The sample size. I'm looking at congregations in different counties, and not all the ones that I have. I was just wondering if I could just open it up to the churches that I really haven't had any contact with before.
Well, and your project really is targeting the youth, so you do.
Yes.
So you do have to find the congregations
that I had
have one the population
that I hadn't worked with before. So.
We have a similar kind of concern. We're looking at schools and districts, and also trying to figure out, we know we can't do everything for our initial but we want to have kind of enough students of each kind of disability so that we will have some sense of whether or not this is going to be more broadly.
So you're going to stratify, basically.
Yes.
We probably will. Well, first, we're trying to enumerate the population of the different kinds of disabilities they are, both in terms of the location and how many there are.
So are you going to randomly sampling in your, according to your stratification, or is it?
For this study, we're mostly working with focus groups, key informants to try to figure out how we're going to initiate it and then maybe pilot test some certain kinds of means of administering the survey. We're not yet at the stage to get a random sample of this group.
But you know, one of the things that this was making me think about is we've talked about for purposes of this project to work with maybe 3 or 4 schools to explore this before we try to run it across the state. But it's making me think about the issues, sort of the characteristics of those school districts or the individual schools. If you're looking at stratifying that, and we want to make sure we have maybe some rural and some, we've talked a little bit about this, but haven't figured it out yet. But selecting those characteristics that you use is kind of the big question.
And part of it's also going to be who we can convince to work with
right.
us.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the other side.
So it's a developmental thing. We tried to convince the leadership group that since we were actually doing primary data collection, we should be getting the 100,000, and the big data people should be getting the 20,000.
All right. So I have a question. In fact, the youth survey, the regular survey, is it a random sample, or do you do it everywhere in each school, or do you randomly select the school?
It's a random sample of the population of the classroom for the YTS. This is something I wanted to talk to you about this. But for the YTS, we enumerate the classrooms that meet the criteria. That we actually include all of the school districts and all of the schools, and then do a random selection of classrooms. Some states do it different. They do a random selection. They get to enumerate. They do a random selection at different levels. They randomly select school districts, and then they randomly select schools within the districts, and then they randomly select classrooms. In our case, we included all districts and all schools, and then randomly selected classrooms.
That met the criteria.
So it's
yeah.
So you randomly select classrooms within each school,
yes,
within each
and
school.
then you administer to all the students in the
In that
classroom.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of cluster randomization because
It's kind of a cluster. One thing actually I wanted to ask you, because one thing we do with the 5th graders, we survey all the 5th graders in Delaware. So it's sort of close to being a census. If you're looking for change over time, how do you decide whether change is significant when you have a census population? Is any change significant? It's not a sample. It's really everybody.
Well, it depends on the characteristics.
I know. Statistically, is there a way?
I guess what you're
Each class.
Well, I didn't mention it, but it was at the bottom of my slide. It was if you're doing the census, if you're getting 100%, you don't need a statistician because.
But so that any change, even if it's minuscule, is it
What
meaningful? Because it's a census.
usually means drawing a conclusion about a population where you haven't. That's what the word statistically significant means. But if that's not really relevant.
Well, no, because the 5th graders change each year.
Well, no,
So you try to compare one class to another, the cohorts are going to be different.
You're comparing all of the 5th graders one year, all of the 5th graders another year, potentially.
So.
But you can argue that your 5th grader are representative of the United States.
Well, the thing. People ask, well, what's your significance level? And I don't really know how to answer the question.
Well, I think what you're getting at is, if you have a big enough sample size, everything's statistically significant.
That's
so if your smoking rate goes
it's a
from
big thing.
6.1% to 6.2%, that may very well be statistically significant because you have such a big sample,
But
it may not be.
enough question. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so what's the effect size?
Right, and so I think you see the same thing with Haynes is that they sample, it's not the same people every year, but it's a representative population every year, and they look at something like obesity rates, and the CDC produces very beautiful maps that show, the United States becoming more and more obese. And any one year compared to another year may not be significant, but when you look at that over 20 years, that trend going from 10% to 35%, that's hugely significant. So I kind of the same thing is, it's not exactly the same people every year being sampled. And comparing any 2 years may or may not be significant. It is really the overall trend.
Sometimes you can look within a high school and you see a group going through. I mean, you can actually see that, for whatever reason, maybe in that, you actually see that there's a higher rate of tobacco use or whatever, and that kind of follows them through from one year to the next. The next group may be a little different, so there is some variation from even from one class to another. But by the time you get statewide, I don't know what happens there. It probably evens out somewhat.
Elise, you had a question?
I was just saying, in our team, we have community health workers and we have actual patients. So when we talked about how we were going to recruit for focus groups, we said, we would have our community health workers help us identify the patients. But isn't that introducing bias to the sample?
Yes. But I think focus groups, and I'm not an expert in focus groups, but here you want some type of enrichment, and so the sampling is not as important as it is for regular statistics or for comparison.
I guess my experience with that has been absolutely, there's this sort of, it's almost snowball sampling in terms of you talk to one group and they can kind of refer you on. That being said, if you're doing some iterative coding, you're not waiting to get all the data at the end, you're coding as you go along. If you're seeing areas where there's disconfirming evidence that isn't the party line, you do tend to more actively go after that so that voice is represented. So rather than looking for representation as a whole, if you've got one aspect of the population that's going, yeah, it doesn't work for me, well, we probably need to talk to a couple more people that might be representative of that population. But I think it's the qualitative is it definitely has its own kind of idiosyncrasies in terms of how you do that research. Yeah.
So you don't see that as much of a problem?
I don't think so. No, I really don't think so.
Because I don't know how we would find them otherwise.
But I think it depends on the questions that you want to ask. I mean, what will you want to ask in the focus group? What type of questions will you want to ask?
Yeah, so we really want to get at the experience that the patients have with the community health workers that's not necessarily related to sort of the traditional biomedical outcomes that the programs themselves are measuring. So things about the value of the relationship that they form with the community health worker, what kind of impact did having sort of the sense of being able to pick up the telephone and get somebody on the other end right away have on your ability to manage your own chronic disease, these sorts of things. And I agree, with the sense of sort of saturation or non-saturation as we're going along and getting this qualitative data. The idea of identifying themes of sort of patient-centered value, there's going to be hopefully some variation within responses within those themes. So in the development perhaps of some specific questions for a survey tool or evaluation tool that might come out of that, it could very well be a sort of a categorical approach in terms of, or an ordinal approach in terms of range of of responses as far as value goes.
I guess the issue that I would see, and I agree, I will go with Liz on that, is that your community health workers will refer to you, to the patients, we refer to the focus group, the patients who are most likely to really have liked the community health workers.
Sure.
Right? So how are you going to evaluate patients who were not so enthused?
Yeah, I think we're probably going to have to come up with, in terms of criteria on who we ask the community health workers to identify or potentially approach. One of those that we've already talked about is sort of in what range of time do we want a patient or a family member of the patients to actually have experienced interacting with the community health workers? Is it a 3-month period or is it a 12-month period? How many interactions are we going to actually qualify as being meaningful? Are we just gonna ask people that have had only one interaction, or more than one interaction, or more than 5
You
interactions?
want to make sure you get both.
Or do you want to get both? Exactly.
So that you get the people that maybe just had one interaction, didn't find it that valuable.
Right.
Like move it along kind of thing. I think that's
Yeah. And we haven't worked out the details of that piece yet, but it's certainly something that we're going to have to consider to get that relative representation, of folks.
And you may need to, you may need to approach the people who didn't, get the experience that you're looking for, or didn't get the value out of it a little bit differently, because sometimes, if they're not enthusiastic about what the program did for them, they're also not as going to be enthusiastic necessarily about coming in for a focus group to come to you.
Sure, no, I agree.
And a bunch of people about it. It's just sometimes you have to kind of select a few of them and talk to them and do more like individual informant type.
I was just wondering, can you get to the source of the link between the person and the community health worker? I mean, that would give you more of a population that you can choose from.
In the sense,
like who assigns the community health worker to the person?
On our team are the 3 entities that hire and manage the community health workers. Is that what you mean?
No, but how do the community health workers get their clients?
Yeah, so
different ways.
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question, and it goes to one of the reasons why we're actually doing the study, or we're trying to do the study, in the sense that so there's, as I mentioned, sort of under this umbrella, there's a wide variety of what people are terming community health workers, right? And so you do have groups of community health workers who are doing work who come from the community setting themselves, and who are doing work within those communities relative to how they identify the needs of that community. So, for instance, they may show up at the church or a faith-based organization and work with, some of the nurses that Levada works with, right? In turn, to say, okay, well, we know that so-and-so has diabetes that they can't control, and we're going to ask the community health worker to visit their home and go through an assessment or something like that, and get them connected with a primary care doctor or something like that, right? Then there's a whole other sort of range of what's being termed community health workers that's much more reliant on a case management model, where you have instead of sort of the community looking inward towards the health system, you have the health system looking outward to the community, where you have an identified group of sort of high-risk patients, right? There's a case manager who kind of oversees that list of patients and assigns a caseload to a particular community health worker, and then that community health worker's job is to go out and identify and contact them and work with them and do that, and that's a completely legitimate model. The problem is that we don't. Well, for one, the models themselves haven't been that well studied overall in terms of the differences between them and what kind of it. And then there's a whole other problem of the more community-based model being driven mostly by grants, external grants and contracts, and the other model being driven mostly by financing, perhaps through health insurance companies or the health system. And there's different ways of evaluating the effectiveness of those two groups. And so what we're proposing is that aside from being able to drive down a high-risk population's cost in the emergency department, or their A1C levels or whatever, which is completely awesome if they can do it, that there's a sense of value that's being elicited from the patient perspective that's not being captured. And if we can do that under this umbrella, then perhaps we can begin to either better stratify how these services are able to be aligned, or figure out better ways of, for instance, including the more community-centric folks in a payment model that would be suitable to both the hospital system and the insurance companies. You know what I mean? That sort of thing. So,
Brian, have you looked at all at the patient satisfaction survey we put together for the Bridges project?
Yeah. We've looked at that, and we've looked at a number of other sort of criteria like like patient activation and things like that that are not necessarily traditionally captured in HCAPs and things like that, right? And those are all, I think those are good, and I think there's something that's still probably missing. And I agree that from my perspective, as far as biasing, any type of direction that this study would go in, we know that right now there's an effort by both CMS as well as payers to, in other states other than Delaware, to move in the direction of including community health workers, a wide range of community health workers, in models of care and the reimbursement.
Reimbursable models of care.
Exactly. And so there's been a group of folks in the state of Delaware who's been working with different stakeholders and the state Medicaid office and trying to come up with some regulatory framework that would allow for that next step to be taken, and it just hasn't been a very fruitful endeavor. And one of the reasons has been pushback in terms of the very things that we're talking about here, the conflict between the more upstream community health models versus the more hospital-centric community health models, and figuring out the best ways to measure those impacts and effectiveness. So that's one of the main reasons why we're thinking about doing this.
So I wanted to ask you a question. How are you going to select your patients, the patients who are cancer survivors?
That's a good question. I have about 800 patients a year that I can sample from just the 3 locations that we have in the state. That was my initial stuff, and whether you broaden it beyond that or not. That's just through the cancer support communities. That's a certain population that's already coming to an organization. So how do we broaden it to make it all people with cancer?
I think the other piece is through, so our project mentor is a gentleman by the name of Scott Seager, who works for Christiana. So, with Christiana, again, there's another database of, several thousand people. Now, for us, the survey piece is absolutely kind of something that we're aiming for the next project. So the next 2 projects that we're thinking is something in terms of the statewide survey, and then wanting to do something that's more programmatic in the community. They're sort of our next 2 studies. But for this one, it really was to do a grassroots needs assessment, and for that to be a bottom-up process that's representative, but certainly not exhaustive. So that will mean that we're sort of getting, some key informants at this level, whether they're a service referral source, a service provider, a service user, or the support person, the service user. So those are kind of our 4 groups. What we had kind of talked about doing first is doing some individual key stakeholder meetings just to figure out, because as Sean said, there's a lot of, believe it or not, there's a lot of players in Delaware in terms of everybody's little, tumor-specific support groups, things of that nature, and talk to these individuals as individuals first before we do focus groups. And right now we have it sort of as a series of probably 3 focus groups where we can sort of get a general lay of the land of them based on the individual groups, sort of work topically at the next focus group, and at the 3rd one have some sort of summary that we can bring back to the group in terms of next steps. So one of the things that we'd really talked about is our sort of our secondary aim with this project is that it will, and as it's sort of this community-based participatory research, is the byproduct we get out of this is as we move forward, we now have a community board that's kind of focused on physical activity, and that doesn't really exist. It's interesting, when we had first started talking, we were talking about doing the survey as part of this one, but I ended up taking it all up because it was just for the time we have and the pod money, it just didn't make sense. That being said, we have a really excellent opportunity to do something that's very Delaware specific with the next survey, and we're very fortunate, or I'm very fortunate to work. I have colleagues that have worked on provincial level and national level surveys that have really done this work over the last decade, that we can take those parts of that really